Correspondent Steve Patterson joins me now from Tempe, Arizona. Steve, let's talk about this new data. What's happening there in Arizona?
Well, look, Allison, and the health officials that I've been speaking to and former health officials and doctors at ASU, I mean, you don't want to inflate the enthusiasm about these numbers, but you also don't want to minimize it either. I mean, this is a big deal. 13% is no small number over a sustained amount of time when testing has been expanded. So it is cause for cautious optimism. I think that is the phrase that is being thrown around the most here in Arizona. People hearing that there is a plateau, that we may actually be, if not at the top of the curve, then coming down slightly if you look at week over week in not only cases, but also hospitalization rates, beds. Normal hospital beds, ICUs, ventilators, all of them trending down at this point. When you were, maybe about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, it was a very different story in Arizona. The state was out of control, and people were not taking the mask order seriously. I think one thing that we've learned in speaking to people that are studying this is that it's a very behavioral virus, that no matter how that how the virus trends is kind of up to the behavior of the people on the ground. He either are exercising vigilance and personal accountability or not. And you can see, just by the fact that in California, they open up business and cases shot up. And here in Arizona, the same thing happened in mid-May with Governor Ducey. Opened up the state, and then you could see, you could track the numbers week by week, almost day by day, just this incredible spike. A lot of people blame the governor for that, for, just essentially not using the phases to kind of get the state through in a way in which would make sense for people, slow enough so people would take it seriously. And so everything just kind of blew up. But it was also really, in speaking and having conversations with the former health officials, it was the psychology, the behavior of people that when they saw that everything was back open, they automatically assume, well, okay, everything's fine. It's that threat level, that's beating down on your back. When everything opens up, you kind of release that sense. So let's give the governor his due here for weeks later, obviously, deciding to shut down bars, reducing indoor restaurants. That has an effect not only on, obviously, you're in an indoor space where air is circulating. That's never a good thing when you have a virus like this. But also the fact that it plays on people's psychology. That, the people I've been speaking to say they've been seeing more people just out and about wearing masks and really taking this seriously because it got very serious. Now, that is not to say that things are over, we're out of the woods, or we can even see the light at the end of the tunnel here in Arizona. It's as if, the car has stopped accelerating. This was described to me. I thought it was very illustrative. But the car has stopped accelerating. Maybe, your foot's not all the way depressed on the pedal, but if it's stopped, it's still over 90 or 100 miles an hour. That's still a very terrifying car ride. I mean, hospitalizations, yes, they're trending down, but beds, ICUs, still over 80% capacity. That is still an incredible strain on frontline healthcare workers who are dealing with an influx of patients, not able to perform elective surgeries, which in many cases are very serious because we're still operating under a crisis care. The health professional I spoke to said he would like to get hospitalizations under 80% for a sustained amount of time before health officials or the governor can even think or dream about getting anywhere close to reopening anything up. Still, bars, and nightclubs, restaurants, that is set to expire. The order that's in place now that has shut those down, set to expire on August 7th. So it's kind of in the ball's in the governor's court to see what's going to happen next based on the data that's been provided. But again, downtrends, always a good thing, specifically when testing has been expanded and the numbers appear to be pretty accurate. Allison?
Steve, I know you spoke with the former health director there in Arizona. What's he saying about these latest numbers and what it means about, where Arizona's heading?
Well, again, cautious optimism. I think when you see numbers like this, it tells you again that people are taking this seriously. But I think there is some worry because a lot of the initial, spike was sort of the underreporting of the seriousness of it. the example set by lawmakers and leadership that led people to think that everything may be more okay than it was. And then when people got serious, that was due to the extreme amount of attention that states get, almost like state shaming, you know, that the whole nation is looking at your state saying, why aren't people wearing masks? Why is everybody doing this? We saw, you know, nightclubs open up. Young people are packing nightclubs. What's going on? And people got the sense of, oh, you know what? This is serious. So health officials now are a little bit worried about people seeing these slight trends, because they are still slight. The numbers are still astronomical when you go back even a few months. I mean, you're talking about something that's been a 645% explosion into new cases to where we are now. Now that that's trending down, again, a good thing, but health officials want to make sure that just because you're seeing some of the numbers decline, just because you're seeing the overall trends plateau, that doesn't mean you have to stop social distancing, washing your hands fervently, wearing masks. It is literally the key to the numbers that are starting to go down now.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.